Hello to everybody, and it's very nice to be hosting and introducing this talk about rural life in medieval Bamiyan. And Bamiyan is in central northern Afghanistan, used to be famous for the great Buddhas that had stood there for years and years and years before they were recently destroyed. But it's also a wonderful microcosm of rural life in Afghanistan from right the way through from the Muslim conquest right the way through to the 13th century and beyond that. And this, it's really important for a couple of reasons, I suppose. The first is that this is an area that's very little known, even in the 20th century, 21st century, very few people have been there. We're in an area where there is a meeting of different cultural and religious traditions. The Muslim tradition coming from the West, the Buddhist tradition coming from the East, and underlying lots of Zoroastrian echoes coming from Iran. So there's a lot going on there, even though it's so remote. There are a lot of different people meeting there, a lot of different people exchanging ideas. But the other thing that makes it so important is the whole new discoveries that we're getting through the Invisible East project, because there are great chronicles that tell us about the comings and goings of kings and that sort of thing, but we get very little handle from these traditional, well-known Muslim chronicles about everyday life. But from the Bamiyan region, just recently, and we're really talking about things that have appeared very recently and are still appearing, we are getting a whole different sort of evidence. The documents that people issued, worked with in their everyday life, their legal transactions, their property transactions, the wills they made, and the way they divided their inheritances, and so on. So suddenly with this, we're getting a whole new perspective away from the elite, away from the world of the courts and the princes, down much more to the level of the people who till the fields, the people who own the lands, the grain merchants, and so on and so forth. And this is what makes the Invisible East project so exciting and so, in a sense, revolutionary in the way that we understand the history of Iran and Central Asia, because we're digging down below the superficial narratives to find a whole different perspective. And Arezou Azad has been the leader of this project and has developed the methodologies and is putting this study of these documents into practice and making them available to us all. So she's a great person for introducing what she's going to be talking about tonight, rural life in medieval Bamiyan. So enjoy what you're hearing.
Thank you very much, Hugh, for the introduction. I would like to welcome everyone to the second session of our online lecture series. And this is following up on last week's lecture by Professor Morgan on the Buddhas of Bamiyan. And we continue this series with a lecture by Dr. Azad on rural life in medieval Bamiyan. As Professor Kennedy already mentioned, Dr. Arezou Azad is a historian of the medieval Islamic East, from the coming of Islam in the 7th century CE to the Mongol Empire of the 13th century and all its various component cultures and societies. Dr. Azad leads two team-focused projects in Oxford, at Oxford. One is the postdoc project funded by the AHRC, and the second one is the Go Local project funded by the European Research Council. Together, these projects make up the Invisible East, and she is the PI of this project, and we are very lucky to have her today. Thank you very much, Arezou, over to you.
Thank you so much, Hugh and Arash, for this very kind introductions. Thank you. Great. So it's wonderful to be back this week again, now our second session. And last week, for those of you who came, Llewellyn Morgan guided us through the Buddhist past of Bamiyan. And today, and actually he also spoke about how the Buddhas were perceived in the medieval period when the Muslim populations had grown in this region. And I'm going to now stay in this medieval period and look at what rural life was like in Bamiyan. So obviously after the time, the Buddhist times. And I will not be talking about Islamization or conversions to Islam. That's going to be covered by my colleague in the fourth session. And I would encourage you to come first come to Alka Patel's talk next week, and then Majid Muntazir Mahdi the week after to hear about Islamization. But today I'm talking about very normal life, if you want. The topic of agriculture and economics is important for anyone who wants to understand the medieval world. Doesn't matter where in the world, whether European medieval history, African medieval history, Chinese, or in this case, Eastern Islamic or Afghan medieval history. Why? Because obviously the majority of the economy depended on agriculture and on what was happening in rural areas. There was no gas, no oil, no modern machinery, no mass production. Obviously, this is long before any of that really starts to take off. There is obviously some manufacturing, some mining and so on, but it's really agriculture that is the mainstay of medieval economies. And I thought I selected for you this quote. Let me see if which I thought was exemplifies the importance of the rural populations to the survival, the sheer survival of these sultanates, who these were the empires that were ruling over this part of Afghanistan. And this is the famous Rashiduddin, who was the vizier to the Mongol rulers. So this is slightly later than the period I'm going to be focusing on, but not too much later. And he's writing a letter to his son. And Rashiduddin is one of the great administrators in the Islamicate world, and he's writing to his son, who's about to take up some administrative duties as well. But the bit that I bolded for you is basically his point is, you know, the taxes are paid by the ra'iyat, that is the common folk, if you want, doesn't matter if they're rural or urban. And without their taxes, basically, there is no rule, there is no court, there is no king, there's no sultan. And I think this really sets the scene very nicely for us. The other thing I wanted to start off with is to tell you a little bit about how scholarship has, in a sense, made it difficult for us to really come to grips with the realities of rural life. Hugh mentioned already, there are two problems I want to highlight. He mentioned the first one I have here, which is this over-reliance really of scholars on grand histories, big tarikh works, which are patronized at courts by rulers for rulers. And these texts are important and fascinating and have their own place, but they don't really help us come to grips with what's happening in rural areas. And also part of this problem is that, and our colleague Jürgen Paul in Hamburg has written about this a lot, is that our scholarship has been stunted in a way by assumptions about rule in this part of the world, that the rulers were despots, or Oriental despots is the term that you frequently find, that they were backward in the sense that the word in sort of popular notions, medieval, often is associated with backwardness, so that there's a kind of backwardness, that they were chaotic, that records were not kept, that these places were lawless. So this is obviously, I'm oversimplifying, but this is currently what is quite dominant in the scholarship. And we are sort of going to offer a different view, obviously. The reason why I mentioned we have this over-reliance on narrative texts, at the same time, what's happened is that we have had a lack of documentary evidence for this part of the world. And that's for several reasons. One is that documents, and what I mean by documents, let me show you. here you go. Documents are what you see on the left-hand side, scraps of paper, often, you know, some coming out of rubbish heaps, often very damaged, often very difficult to read, stuck together, caked in mud. You know, this is not the beautiful manuscript paper that you see, a beautiful Shahnameh page with illuminations that a library will display as a showpiece or a museum. This is really sort of rough stuff. So as a consequence, these documents perhaps also weren't so interesting for people to study. But the other reason why we actually haven't had is the other thing, that we actually haven't had a lot of documents surviving from this region. And it's, as Hugh said, really only in the last 6 to 8 years, sorry, that a large set of documents in Persian from this part of the world has become available to the public. Documents come with benefits in the sense that they are not curated. They are as they were at the time. Some people, Anne Lambton notably, who wrote seminal works on land administration in the medieval Persianate world, got close, but she never used documents. She used collections of documents made at courts, in the Seljuk court, which was ruling in the neighboring regions at the same time as, we will see, the Ghurids who were ruling when most of these documents were written. Yeah, sorry, I just lost my point I was trying to make. But the documents, anyway, were not. Oh, sorry, that was my point. So the compilations were obviously produced by rulers again, with a different purpose. The purpose being to have templates of documents for scribes. And so they were carefully selected. So that's not quite the same. So to give you some context, I would say to historians, documents, especially of European medieval history, have been really valued as very important sources for European history. They've been used for the history of the Western Islamic lands, in Egypt in particular, the Cairo Geniza, but also earlier papyri. But for the Islamicate East, Afghanistan, this is all really very, very new. So I mentioned, to give you some context, the documents I'll be talking about were written mostly when the Ghurids or the Shansabanis, we'll be hearing more about them next week, were ruling over this area, and they are responsible for some of the most stunning architecture that has survived in this part of Afghanistan. They come from originally from Ghur, which is in modern-day Afghanistan, and their capital being at Firuzkoh, which is shown here, but then also had sultanate capitals, one of which was in Bamiyan. And you can see that when our documents were written, their empire had extended westwards all the way to include parts of Iran, modern-day Iran, Gorgan, Nishapur, also Central Asia. Marv is indicated here, so Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and also eastwards into what's today Pakistan. Until they were vanquished, by the Khwarezmshahids, who came from up north from Central Asia in the 1210s, and then ultimately, obviously, by Genghis Khan and the Mongols, who actually arrived a year after the last of our documents was written. So the sheets I'm going to show you there are 200 of them that were written in New Persian, that is Persian in Arabic script. There are another 20 or so that were written in Hebrew script Persian, so Judeo-Persian, and they date from the 11th to 13th centuries, all of them. I will not be talking about the Judeo-Persian ones today, which are from the earlier period. And they were purchased by the National Library of Israel about 6 to 8 years ago. And you can find them on the National Library of Israel website under the name of Afghan Geniza. This is a term we don't use because it's doubtful that especially the Arabic script documents had anything to do with Jewish Geniza, which the term Jewish synagogue, sorry, which the term Geniza implies. So as far as we know, these Bamiyan Papers are the oldest large set of Persian documents available to the public in the world. Now that's a big one to take in. The oldest large set of Persian documents available to the public in the world. To highlight that point, we have produced, my colleague Pejman Firuzbakhsh produced this timeline, which again shows you so the oldest Persian writing that we know of is in a Quranic tafsir text of the 10th century, which is incidentally also in Jerusalem. But then after that follow these Bamiyan Papers. Some of you might immediately think, wait a minute, what about the Shahnameh? Wasn't that written around the same time as the earliest Bamiyan Papers? That's true, yes, but in fact, we don't have the original copy that was written back then. The earliest copy that survives is from 2 centuries after these National Library of Israel documents were written. And we're talking about original documents here. So this is quite incredible, really. You can please do take the time and look at these tools that we have created on our website. Here's another one I just wanted to show you, which is what we call a story map. So to get to the story map, let me just tell you what we had to do. Because these are so old, these documents, we had no precedents really to work with. And when I say we, I really mean Pejman Firuzbakhsh. He had a gargantuan task of deciphering the paleography, that is the handwriting, and I'll show you some examples in a moment, and the orthography, that is the spelling of these documents. He did then eventually, he has now, 4 years later, managed to transcribe all the new Persian documents into typographical Persian. Once he'd done that, then he and I could look at all these sheets of paper and then start trying to find patterns and deciphering places, and we did, and finding dates. And so this story map is something I urge you to try out. It's actually quite high tech. It doesn't look it, but it is. So it's you can zoom in to almost to street level on this. And you can see, if you click on these buttons on the side, will pop up all kinds of information about the documents that have come from these places, and you'll find it in our resources section. So once we deciphered all of the documents, we started piecing the puzzle together. And for today, I've selected for you one group out of these 200 documents, and this group consists of 47 sheets of the Bamiyan Papers, and we now know that these came from a governmental storehouse of agricultural goods. So how did we figure that out? First of all, we spotted the recurrence of one name, of Abu Bakr ibn Umar, who appeared sheet after sheet, not in any order, by the way. It was only after reading all of them that we were able to, our eyes started to pick up on this name. And then after that, we recognized a second name, which we now believe to be his son. So Ali ibn Abu Bakr. And most of these sheets are dated and over a span of 64 years, as you can see down here. And impressively, Abu Bakr ibn Umar clearly held his position in the storehouse for 30 years, which is impressive. So now we finally had something concrete to work with. So what was this storehouse? It was a repository which held agricultural commodities, mainly grains, and which were managed by these two men in succession, who are identified as ambardars, ambardar meaning storage manager. The location of the storehouse is not mentioned, but it must have been somewhere in the suburban vicinity of Bamiyan, which we can tell from the references to Bamiyan, and Bamiyan being one of the satellite capitals, if you want, of the Sultanate. And as Hugh mentioned, we actually know very little about medieval Bamiyan partly because it's been studied principally as a Buddhist site of late antiquity. But we want to sort of correct that imbalance a little bit. But we're not the first. There are also some important there was some important archaeological research conducted in the medieval city of Bamiyan. And in the 1930s, for example, excavations also resulted in finds of sheets of paper, and we think that this might well be the beginning of what we now call the Bamiyan Papers. So let me tell you a little bit about what we found. First of all, we found typologies basically of the documents, and we found 4 types. And these are 4 well-known types of documents that you will find used across the Islamic world all the way to Egypt and Syria. The first and the most common type was the receipt. So these are receipts issued by the ambardar, the storehouse manager, to farmers who are making deliveries of cashless tax payments to the ambar, to the storehouse, the governmental storehouse. And I'll be showing you examples of these shortly. Then the second type is we have checks issued. I'll show you some in a minute. Then legal declarations, again written in a very common, well-known format known as the iqrar. And then internal state correspondence, memos, letters between state officials, and some internal lists. So what do they actually tell us? They tell us, I think I'm going to highlight 6 points for you today. First of all, what's interesting is that the ambardar was hugely influential in making sure the tax collection system worked. And that was a surprise to us. Some things are perhaps less surprising, but this role of the ambardar was surprising, so much so that even Abu Bakr had direct executive authority over the police, the Shehna officials. We have letters from him directing them to go out to the villages and collect taxes that were in arrears. So you have taxes that the farmers are delivering, but then there are cases where they are behind on certain installments, and then the ambardar will write to the Shehna official and tell him, you go there and get what's owed. So this direct authority to uniformed personnel seems to have waned under his son, Ali, perhaps because at this point then we have a new regime in place. We have the Khwarazm Shah regime, so maybe something changed and that power was lessened. So although the Abu Bakr, as I said, was very powerful, he still received his orders from a higher divan. Divan here, divan a'la, so a higher divan, which in this case was headed by a chap called Umar. You can see that the Umar is the circle below for those who can't read Arabic script, and so it's emblazoned, it's bold, it's large, but it's just a first name. And it functions very much as a letterhead of, in this case, we think this is an imperial finance authority that was perhaps even reporting directly to the vizier, so to the prime minister, if you want, of the empire. And this is a check that was issued by the divan to Abu Bakr, our ambardar, our warehouse manager, ordering him to give a specified amount of commodity. So the commodity is always centered. So these formats are repeated over and over again. So on the left-hand side, you have gandum, wheat. On the right-hand side, qalle, so grain. And then followed by amounts. And these amounts are always given first in full, and then in the half amount on the other side of the sheet, which is an age-old practice and is used here as well. sort of to counter against the possibility of falsification of amounts. And then this is closed off with a standard phrase, in this case, اعتماد بر این نشان کند. So he was obviously not totally, so Abu Bakr, I mean, not totally free to do what he wanted, but another clue we found that show us what a high status he enjoyed was in the way people addressed Abu Bakr in their correspondence. And in their correspondence, they would use, as was usual, epithets, titles, and so on. And these are or honorifics. So you find all these titles we've listed here, and the one that, you know, once he's in the job, if you want 20 years in the 1170s, he becomes a mu'tamid al-dawla, mu'tamid al-mulk, so a trustworthy one of the empire. And if you think about it, I mean, given that taxes were so key to the survival of the Sultanate, and given that the Ambardar had control over all this wealth that was coming in, he was basically functioned like the head of a central bank. And so you can imagine the levels of wealth he controlled and the expectation of him to be of high moral character, hence these epithets. And perhaps his survival for 30 years in the job is a testament to that. I mean, what administration nowadays can boast such continuity of a sort of mid-level administrator? But it's interesting that the Ambardar doesn't even appear in the administrative manuals, probably because he's not at ministerial level, but just underneath it, but still enjoys so much power. The second thing we learned was that who the farmers were. So the farmers are mentioned in the delivery records. I'll show you in a minute. But who were they? How much power did they have? Were they poor? Were they rich? But so the first place for us to look was Anne Lambton's seminal works on rural administration in Persia, as she obviously called it in her time. And the term that appears in our documents is barzigar. So barzigar, and Lambton defines barzigar as a small-scale peasant who is occasionally land-owning. In fact, I learned recently from my colleague Iskandar Sadeghi Borujerdi that Anne Lambton based an entire policy platform in her advice to Iranian and British officials with a view to engendering an agrarian reform in Iran and Persia. She based it on this notion of what a barzigar was. But the Bamiyan Papers give a very different qualification or coloring of a barzigar. In the Bamiyan Papers, the barzigar is basically a posh farmer. So he enjoys titles like Rais, Khaje, Faqih, Muhtasib, Sarhang, Sepah, no, not Sepah, so Sarhang, yes. So they were the most educated, the most senior people with wielding power at the rural level. So this is very different from the farmers shown in this image, for example, receiving land deeds from the Shah in the 1960s, or indeed the way they were described by Lambton. So just to show you how barzigars, for those of you who can read Persian, you might enjoy this. So you can see how we deciphered the text. So on the left-hand side, you have a barzigar faqih, so a barzigar who is some kind of legal scholar, and on the right-hand side, a barzigar sarhang, so some kind of farmer who is also a military official. That's the farmers. Now, the police. I mentioned already a little bit about them, but what I didn't say is the other thing you can learn from the Bamiyan Papers is that the police were policed. So I don't know if any of you watch Line of Duty, but I'm a big fan. And in Line of Duty, it's a British show. It's all about a part of the British police who oversee the conduct of police officers and sniff out what they call bent coppers. So in the Bamiyan Papers, we have two police officials who in previous years were sent to collect arrears from farmers, and then in later papers are then summoned to come to headquarters, so to speak, on account of suspicions of misconduct, and an envoy is even sent to collect them, and a special note is made that for the envoy to tell them, to tell these two Shehna officials that basically refusing to come would be problematic, would not bear fruit, or some kind of threatening language is included. I mentioned the legal declarations that are part of this set. These are actually declarations made by Shehna officials who are collecting debt. It's interesting. They have to then sign a legal, not sign, but they have to make a legal declaration in which they basically become liable for, or they take over the debt of the farmer, because they're now holding on to these grains or whatever it is, and they're sort of in transit to the warehouse. So they actually need to make that legal commitment, again, probably as a way to avoid any sort of abuse of power and miscarriage, if you want, of justice. The fourth thing we can learn. So we wanted to know, okay, so what then happens to the grains and so on once they arrive in the storehouse? Obviously, new deliveries can't stay in these warehouses for long, as they begin to rot and attract rodents, and then that would render them unconsumable, obviously, and cause lots of problems. So unfortunately, the set that is currently publicly accessible doesn't tell us what happened after the grains arrived into the warehouse, but presumably, being such large amounts, as I'll show you in a minute, they would have been transported on to consumers, not least of all the courts themselves, to markets where they'd be sold on, and so on. But there's one, so like I say, you know what comes into the warehouse, we don't really know what goes out. There's one exception though, where a few of our documents show us that in fact, if you as a farmer, for example, had a bad crop and you did badly this year, you can go to the bank and you can get a credit of grain. So ambar zakhire, it's called in the documents. And so the ambar effectively also functioned as a grain bank, and grain banks still exist in parts of the world today, most famously exemplified by the Grameen Bank that gives loans to low-income people without any collateral. In this case, the storehouses issued seed money to farmers, and these farmers had military titles usually, so perhaps these were holders of land grants, iqtas, that they received in exchange for military service. And Anne Lambton, in fact, had observed a similar sort of seed money being issued to iqta holders in the Seljuk domains, so this seems very plausible. So I said I'd talk about 6 things. We've gotten through 4, so I hope you can bear with me for 2 more. So my 5th observation is that the storehouses kept immaculate records. So we know this despite the uneven survival of the documents. They were probably organized by year, and we think this because out of the documents, there's one year that stands out, 1169, for which we have sort of 70%, I think, of the or maybe 60% of the documents. They were also checked against ledgers. So here I'm pointing to a diagonal stroke that was made across the sheet of paper. This shows that a later hand actually checked these documents and then probably compared them against a ledger, or actually compared them against a previously defined amount or quota for a particular area. That's one hand. And then we have other documents with other annotations as well, which show that they were actually checked later on against ledgers, or where they basically served as the raw material for recording in ledgers incomings. That's what I'm trying to say. And we know that these ledgers were kept from accountancy manuals from Shiraz in the 14th century, and it's very possible that I think it's extremely likely that the same thing is going on here. The offices were not only keeping immaculate records, they were professional. So I showed you a letterhead from the High Divan. I wanted to show you the letterhead of our friend Abu Bakr ibn Umar. So here in the circle, I'm just showing you his name as it appears, Abu Bakr ibn Umar, in a stylized form, and it's repeated sheet after sheet. So this is his letterhead, and it was actually this letterhead that gave us the clue that led to our finding this archive. The documents are all very predictable. They follow templates, and I've listed it for you, shown you here more or less how a receipt worked. A short note on the paper: you might notice that this paper is not perfect. It doesn't have perfect lines, certainly not on top. It's folded. I don't know if you can see the fold lines, and if you could see the back, which you can't obviously right now, because this is a photo, you would see that many of these sheets have other writing on the back that is not related to what's written on the other side. So a lot of these papers are actually recycled, which adds obviously a whole other layer of really interesting material to research. And in this case, we're even luckier, because what's on the back side, we have now recently identified, comes from other parts of the state machinery, from the finance machinery. So it's really amazing stuff for us. But what I wanted to say also is that so the paper here, you can tell it comes from originally a longer sheet of paper that was then cut into pieces, probably at the point of recycling, and then perhaps even bought by the Ambar, by the office, or indeed inherited from other parts of the state administration. And this kind of recycling is also very prevalent in the Cairo Geniza, for example, from the Fatimid administrative archives. The final point I wanted to make of what you can learn is, well, rather, can we now make sort of aggregate, if you want, economic analyses of the economic situation in Bamiyan based on these documents? So the answer, in a way, to put it bluntly, is no, if you're looking for hard statistics. But we can get a really good, nice, rare, unusual sense of the contours of the economy in Bamiyan at this time. So here's a pie chart, and what you get from this pie chart is what sorts of products were taxed and hence grown. So you can see that wheat was by far the largest tax crop, followed by grain, ghalle, which is probably some kind of lower grade grain. We know that because in some of the lists that I mentioned that are in the recycled backs of the documents, we have prices listed, and when comparing the pricings of the different products, you can see that wheat was obviously more expensive and hence higher grade. We can also see how much was delivered per estate, if you want. So the largest single delivery in 1169, for example, I mentioned that that's the year in which we have the highest number of documents by far. So the largest single delivery was as high as 2,327 man of grain. So man is obviously the volume of measurement for weighing this grain, and it equates to 2 tons of grain. So man is about 0.83 grams. And I mean, this is what we think. The man has, its value has changed drastically over time and across different regions. But if we look at sources that are closer to our period and to our region, this is what we get. So that's about, if that's right, our conversion rate, that's about 2 tons of grain just from one estate in one installment. In this case, the delivery was not made by one farmer, it was made by a group of 11 farmers. So this is another interesting point is, you know, do the farmers actually, some of the farmers work in collectives or some kind of consortium or grouping? You know, that's what it would seem like, but it's something we'd need to look into more. The sizes of the deliveries varied widely and could be as little as 1 donkey load or as much as 10. But the average delivery we found was about 161 man, which equates to 134 kilos. Talking about donkeys, so we can also learn from these documents. This is not my 7th point, I'm still in the 6th, but it's towards the end of it, about the mode of transport for transporting these goods. And the mode of transport was donkeys. And I mentioned this recently to Richard Bulliett a couple of weeks ago when I saw him in a conference in Spain. And he was very excited about that because you might have heard about the Bactrian camel, which is believed to have come from this area. And the camel, as Professor Bulliett told me, is not only way cheaper because it doesn't drink water, it can carry a lot more. But the camel wasn't used, it was donkeys. And donkeys were not only used for carrying goods, the donkeys also appear in the texts that deal with the shihna, with the police. So the police, when they're sent off to collect the arrears of taxes, we are told go off with donkeys, and the people who receive them on the other end, we have some letters where the state administrator, the ambassador, has written to the person on the other end saying, I'm sending a police officer to you. Please make sure that the donkey gets enough water, and please pay him the rental for the donkey. So, you know, everything comes with a price. Knowing the average delivery to have been 134 kilos, as I mentioned, and knowing that one donkey can carry about 50 to 70 kilos, the average farmer probably needed 2 donkeys for each tax installment delivery. So, you know, I won't talk much more about donkeys other than we also have a document in which we read about a donkey express, so a kharbandagan, which is again all wonderfully real and relatable. So we can also learn a little bit about the harvesting timeline if you want, the schedule. So as you can see, 77% of the receipts issued to the farmers are were issued and actually in October, November, so in the autumn season, which was the harvest season. We can also learn a little bit about yield amounts per estate. So the cashless, I mentioned that for 1169, the cashless harvest tax amounted to nearly 3 tons, or maybe I didn't mention that, but that is what it was. And if we assume that the tax rate was about 20%, as we know from Persian narrative sources, but also from accountancy manuals from the medieval period, this would give us a yield of nearly 15 tons for that year. It's of course, again, possible that these receipts are only a fraction of what was actually delivered, but even as a fraction, this seems a lot to us. So before I get too carried away about donkeys and yields and so on, let me close my talk by summarizing that documents shed a rare light on the way agriculture was managed by estate farmers and managers, and how the state taxed and policed, the rural administrators in charge of collecting taxes. We learned that farming was relatively large scale. We're talking annual tonnages, not small bushel amounts of tax. Farmers were occasionally organized in collaborations, it seems, perhaps some kind of collective. The administration was systematized with central control, but with decentralized authority at regional levels. So clearly much more work is needed. I hope I gave you a little bit of a taster of what we're dealing with here, but I think it's already fair to say, to conclude if you want, that the Oriental despotism notion and chaos theories that abounded, especially on the medieval East, are misplaced. On the contrary, the system had norms, it had continuity, it was driven by revenue and profit that was managed carefully by farmers and teams working under them. I thank you for your attention, and I'll stop it here. And thank you, Arash. Thank you, Hugh, for opening this session, and have a wonderful week, and see you, as many of you, next week as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arezou.
Bye.
Bye-bye.